think I don't want to keep you behind, so I'm going to hand it over to Jacob, and Jacob's going to do a presentation for us. Give you some examples, not just of memorialisation through museums, but also Jacob is a creative practitioner himself and is hugely passionate about poetry. So he's going to give us some examples of his work in his freelance capacity as well. And following the presentation today, there'll be an opportunity for us to have a questions and answers sessions. And then to end the session, we'll then do a reflection moment at the end. So enjoy and welcome to today's session. And Jacob, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tanwen. I'm just going to share my screen now, so hopefully this works. Okay, can you all see the first slide? Is that clear? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Do you know what? I'm going to try and another way, because I can't actually see that very well myself. 1 second, sorry. Let me just see if I can just share my screen rather than the PowerPoint. 1 second, sorry about this. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that again, but do just let me know if you can't. So yeah, thank you all very much for coming to listen to me today. As Tanwen says, my name is Jacob O'Sullivan. I'm Museum Development Manager for Museums Galleries Scotland. And I'm going to be focusing on, how museums memorialise the past and the present, while still responding to political, cultural and social issues. And I think there are some really kind of big topics here, and one of the reasons I was very keen to sort of put this in a PowerPoint was just because when I was sort of approaching this question, I felt like there were so many different ideas and different kind of layers to this that I was getting a bit all over the place in kind of how I was approaching the answers to this. So really, from my own point of view, I just thought it would be easier for me to try and put my thoughts in order and kind of try and create a bit of a bit of a narrative to this that perhaps makes sense as we go along. So hopefully that'll be clear. But then I look forward to having a bit of a conversation afterwards. I'm sort of approaching this. I'm at the office now, Museums Galleries Scotland office, and I'm approaching this very much from Museums Galleries Scotland point of view. But as Tanwen says, I also was really keen to kind of do this sort of from an individual point of view as well, and sort of talk a little bit about my own views of the museum sector more widely, but also kind of the act of memorialisation and creative responses to heritage and to big events. So that's where we are here anyway. So as I say, throughout this presentation today, I'm going to introduce the work of Museums Galleries Scotland and my own role more widely. Some of you might already be aware of the work of Museums Galleries Scotland, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the museum sector in Scotland to some extent. I'm also going to look at the role of museums in communities and sort of try and introduce the idea of museums as being just a fundamental aspect of the communities that they work with, as well as looking at the responsibilities that museums face, the stories they tell and don't tell, the role of communities in working with museums, so perhaps a requirement of communities to get involved in museums in some ways, as well as more generally approaches to memorialisation, which I just think was such an interesting topic anyway, so I'm really pleased to be talking on this today. Throughout, if you have any questions or anything like that, or any points you'd like to raise, please do so or put them in the chat. I can't actually see the screen very well on the Teams page, but I'm sure Tanwen will let me know if there's been any questions or anything like that. But we can obviously have a conversation afterwards as well. This shouldn't be too long as a presentation. Okay, so Museums Galleries Scotland, who we are, what we do. So Museums Galleries Scotland is the national development body for museums and galleries in Scotland, which is kind of an interesting definition because there's lots of repeated words, but it's the simplest way really of describing what Museums Galleries Scotland, or MGS, what we do. We support a sector of 430 museums and galleries, and I think that is an exact number. We used to say 400 plus, but I think we've pinned it down now to 430. And obviously these museums are the length and breadth of the country. We do this primarily through the following ways. So we provide funding, and MGS is slightly unusual as a funder in that we exist. We're one of the few funders, I think, that exist primarily or almost exclusively for museums, museums and galleries. And I should have said throughout, I'll be probably use the word museums, but I mean museums and galleries. It just makes it a bit simpler when I talk about the sector. So we're a funder for museums and collections work quite specifically, which is quite different to many funders. But we also have dedicated funds for. We had some, for example, for emergency responses to COVID when museums were not able to open, things like this. So that's where a lot of our work goes into funding the sector. But we also have an important advisory role, so lots of responding to queries that come in and kind of providing a bit of an advisory steer to the museum sector. Advocacy is a really important part of our role. So this is really advocating on behalf of the great work that museums do in their communities and in society more generally, and kind of discussing this with the government, for example, or with local authorities to try and ensure that backing is there and that understanding of the power of museums is there. Workforce development is an interesting one because this is work we do about trying to ensure that there are diverse ways into the museum sector, into working in the museum sector, whether that's as paid staff or volunteering, and just to ensure that the museum workforce is as diverse as the communities that museums work within. We also look at partnership development, so creating partnerships out with the museum sector, which is a really important part of I think what we're talking about today as well as the two museum standard schemes of accreditation and recognition, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on, I think. And we do all of this under the National Strategy for Museums and Galleries in Scotland, which is a 10-year strategy, which is currently up for renewal. We're currently working on a new strategy and the delivery plan, which kind of underpins this. And this is for both the museum sector and the work of Museums Galleries Scotland. So just a little look at the makeup of the sector more widely. So as I say, there are 430 museums and galleries, and these are stretching from Whithorn in the southwest all the way up to, I think there are 2 museums on the Isle of Unst in Shetland, which I think is the most northerly inhabited part of the British Isles. So you can kind of really see the vast geographical spread of our museums in many ways. And I think looking at this map, it really shows how there are museums and galleries in every single local authority area. But also, if this was mapped on to named place names in Scotland, really there are museums and galleries in most population centres, and most geographical communities have at least one museum that they can link to and that they can work with, which I think in terms of thinking about memorialisation is clearly a really kind of powerful resource at our disposal, whether responding to memorialisation kind of creatively or looking at historical issues like that as well. Throughout the museum sector, there are 259 accredited and 171 non-accredited museums. So accreditation is the museum standard scheme. It's not a requirement that all museums are accredited at all, but for many museums that works well, and that's the scheme that we run. And on this map, I think red is accredited museum and sort of yellowy orange is non-accredited. And I think you can tell that because Fair Isle Museum is accredited, and you can see the red dot there in between Orkney and Shetland, which I think shows that well. Obviously, museums and galleries are a massively valuable asset to all our population centres. They deliver across They deliver across the National Performance Framework, and museums and galleries can be physical spaces which tend to make us happier, healthier, smarter, and more connected to where we live. You know, museums and galleries play such an important part in an understanding of an idea of place and of community, which again is going to be really important today, I think. Museums and galleries are obviously a major role in tourism and in supporting the local economy. And according to Visit Scotland statistics, culture and heritage is the second most important reason why visitors come to Scotland. So you can really get an impression of the real potential and real importance that museums play in this role. I'm not sure what the first reason is why people are coming to Scotland. I might have thought that this was that, but it shows that culture and heritage is a really important driver, both for tourism and for local communities and local users. Just a bit then of a look at the makeup of the museum sector of our 430 museums across the country. So you can see the vast majority in this chart, the vast majority are independent museums. So these tend to be museums which are often very, very rooted in physical community. Often they have been started by community members. Often the workforce is made up almost exclusively of people from the communities that they're representing. And there's real variety amongst the independent museums. So these are museums which aren't linked to a wider local authority or to the national museums. They're kind of standalone, but there's very big ones like Scottish Maritime Museum or the Scottish Fisheries Museum. And then there's much smaller local ones which often maybe form part of a library, for example. You know, things like this. There's really great variety, but the independent museums especially, I think, are a wonderful kind of resource to tap into in terms of creative responses to issues such as the pandemic, you know, things like this. We then have ALIOs and local authority museums, so that's arm's length external organisation museums and the local authority museums, and usually these are run by the local authority and have a collection which is reflective of that region. So again, you know, it might be the local authority collection is held in these museums. So again, an interesting one to link up with. We then have Historic Environment Scotland and National Trust for Scotland museums, university museums, the national museums, which is obviously National Museums of Scotland, National Galleries of Scotland, and then military or regimental museums. And these are museums which are linked to a particular regiment and often are funded by the MOD as well. So just really wanted to keep this here because it just gives an impression of the diversity of the museum sector, the different type and size of museums, the different reasons that they exist, and also the kind of the different things that might be talked about with their collections, and the different stories that these museums might tell. Oh, and yeah, so just a quick overview of my role. So yeah, this is a funny little picture from a few years ago to kind of give an impression of some of the kind of talks and stuff that we do just to share knowledge about the sector. But key responsibilities are, yeah, support for museums and galleries in their collections work and interpretation in terms of the stories they're telling. Support for new and emerging museums. So a really interesting part of the role is quite often community groups maybe come together with and have started a small collection of objects. And quite often these groups are like, well, what next? You know, so this is about trying to help them with that and kind of say, well, is a museum the best option? If so, you can follow these steps. Sometimes a museum isn't the best option. And again, I think that's interesting in today's conversation. Knowledge exchange programming. So this is a series of talks in which we try and share kind of innovative and interesting practice across the museum sector. Potentially quite similar to the Remembering Together talks like this, actually, because it's about just trying to create a place where people who work in museums can come and learn from examples of other practice. So do the programming there, and I'm going to share a link of all of the videos because there are some interesting ideas that have been captured there, I think. Recognition scheme management. So recognition is another standard scheme that we work with for some of the nationally important collections which aren't held by national museums. And an really exciting part of the role is kind of museum decolonisation. So that there's a lot of talk about this at the moment. So part of this is about keeping track of repatriation and restitution requests across the museum sector, but also more generally decolonisation as an idea of the language we use, for example, and the stories we're telling. As well as obviously support for museums experiencing difficulties. So if a museum might be faced with closure, for example, I would work with them quite closely. And management of intangible cultural heritage in the museum sector in Scotland is quite an important part of the role, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But yeah, I just wanted to again give a bit of an overview of museums and memorialisation and the stories that museums choose to tell. So one of the kind of the slogans and commitments that museums work under now is the idea that museums are not neutral. This was developed by the Museums Association and the sector more widely. But I suppose it's about moving away from any idea of neutrality from museums and saying that actually, if museums are truly reflective of the communities that they represent, they need to be reflective of that community views, and they need to be part of a wider kind of discourse around what it means to be alive right now, and what it means to have the past that we have, but also potentially, if it's right for the museum, to have the present that we have. And I think museums are really great at that and really good at tapping into wider societal conversations and issues. One of the things that I think is really important in the context of today's conversation is to kind of understand museums as being the same as the communities that they work with. You know, the right kind of community input and engagement with the museum collection. Really, the museums are a public expression of a community voice or a community idea in many ways, and I think that's a really interesting kind of power to kind of link up with for that. So the idea then that museums are not neutral, and therefore neither are the stories they tell. So anything that a museum chooses to display, and any kind of big idea or interpretive technique that a museum chooses to use, and the objects that they put on display in a particular order, obviously this is all deliberately done, and the stories that they're telling have been deliberately chosen. And I think this is a really can be a kind of really loud thing actually to understand. And crucially then, neither are the stories that they choose not to tell. And I think this is a really interesting idea, that if a museum isn't engaging with a massive part of history or a massive part of what's been going on in community or society, that can reverberate, that can be kind of heard quite widely. So, for example, obviously the context of today is kind of considering the impact of COVID and the pandemic, which obviously affected everybody in many different ways, but had a huge impact on everybody who visits a museum, who works in a museum, who's a member of community, everybody in the world. So it's really interesting that if a museum is choosing not to address this, that's obviously in some ways a deliberate choice often. Often it's complicated by stuff like collecting around this. There might not be storage space, for example. There might not be exhibition space to tell contemporary stories like this. But I think whatever the reasons, that can feel like a non-neutral choice, which is just quite an interesting thing to consider. And then to look, I think, at what some of the approaches that museums did take when considering kind of contemporary collecting and rapid response collecting in responding to big issues like, for example, the pandemic. So this is a presentation that Glencoe Folk Museum gave to us, to MGS, and I think about April and May 2020. So it was quite early on. And it was really interesting because they had deliberately chosen to go down the path of rapid response collecting. So they recognised that this was a really important, really significant time for lots of people, for most people, and wanted to reflect this in the museum collection. So you see here, for example, two of the banners here: "Go home, stay home. It's a pandemic, not a holiday. Go home, please. A pandemic is not code for a holiday." And I thought that was really interesting in the context of this talk, because it really shows that although everybody was affected by COVID and by lockdown, it did also have a very strong community or regional differences and kind of different focus. So obviously these banners are directly in response to a perceived kind of notion of people coming up from the cities to the highlands, for example, to either to escape lockdown and you know, go to the country, and people, that the communities who live there all the time, saying, you know, this is a pandemic, not a holiday, don't come here, is a really interesting response. And it's very different to the local response to where I live in Leith, for example, where, you know, this wasn't happening. And I think it's really interesting because you can see that there's a strong geographical community difference to how things like the pandemic were responded to and understood, and therefore the role of independent community museums in reflecting this remains really localized, which I just think is quite an interesting approach. And as I say, this is from a presentation that the Glencoe Folk Museum gave to us, you know, at the time of them doing it as well. And this is just another slide from Glencoe Folk Museum, which again, you know, lots of familiar images here. For example, the rainbows, you know, which we all saw in our communities, but against these amazing backdrops, which are obviously quite unique and like I say, very different to where I live, and I'm sure the same for many people in the audience today. And actually also wanted to, I don't know if you can see my mouse thing there, but wanted to bring up the idea of social media and kind of digital collecting as well, and kind of the need for communities and museums to be aware of digital collecting, social media collecting, and making sure that that is an important part of any response to what's going on at the time. So yeah, looking at this idea of museums being basically the same as the communities that they exist within, I thought this was a really interesting quote from the Remembering Together website. "When people experience difficult times, being together in community can help us heal." So if you imagine that museums are really the same as the community that they exist within, the idea that they can be really brilliant physical spaces to bring communities together to partake in community activities really highlights the importance of museums and galleries as useful kind of physical spaces for a lot of this memorialisation. If we understand museums as community spaces, then we must also really understand museums as healing spaces, definitely, potentially. And I think getting involved with what museums can offer, and also the great resource of their material cultural collections, is a really great opportunity for physical communities in this way. And here's just an image from Bigger Museum. This was taken as part of the festival museum, so it's pre lockdowns, but you can just see, you know, people having a great time and coming together and potentially kind of working together to work through these challenging histories as well. And that kind of brings us on to intangible cultural heritage, which was, as was said in the beginning, is kind of an important part of my role and the work that Museums Galleries Scotland is expanding into. So for anybody not familiar with intangible cultural heritage, this is a definition from UNESCO. So cultural heritage does not end at monuments and collections of objects. It also includes traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants, such as oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, or the knowledge and skills to produce traditional crafts. So all of those kind of categories to me seem like a clear potential to bring people together, and to work together to celebrate something or to memorialize something, you know. And I think just as every community, every place in Scotland ought to have access to a museum collection. Every place, every community, whether it's a geographically linked community or a community of interest, or you know, a cultural community, will all have shared intangible cultural heritage in some ways. You know, these different categories are really huge. So you can really kind of see the potential here. And this is an image of the Clutie Well. I think this is the one on the Black Isle. I might be wrong, but this is a really interesting example of intangible cultural heritage, or ICH, as I'll also call it now. And again, in the context of the pandemic, you know, I think what, obviously, just in case somebody doesn't know, what this is showing is a tree above, usually a holy well, upon which people have tied rags or bits of clothing. The idea being that when these decompose, so will any ailment of the person who's tied it onto the tree. And I believe that some of these saw an increase in use, you know, during the pandemic, which is just a really interesting idea. And again, I think the kind of the potential for using a practice like this for memorialisation of quite a challenging time is really clear, and there's a lot of room there, I think. So I've said the main quote here, but just to look a bit more at ICH. So intangible cultural heritage is traditional, contemporary, and living all at the same time. It is inclusive, representative, and community-based. So an important idea behind intangible cultural heritage is that it doesn't have a kind of necessarily like a gatekeeper or like a central authority. It's defined by the community of practitioners, which is just, again, a really interesting lot of power there, because it doesn't have to be defined by anybody who's not doing it. You know, it's defined by the communities that do these practices. And it's linked. It's explicitly linked into the government's culture strategy as well. One of their aims of this is to recognise each community's own local cultures in generating a distinct sense of place, identity, and confidence. And again, the possibilities of intangible practices, locally distinct practices, in generating this idea of a sense of place, and of community identity and cohesion, and of course confidence. Again, this can really be enacted well with community events of living intangible heritage. So some examples of ICH. So this is something I put together. So it's not exhaustive, and it's not like I say, that there's not a central authority on a lot of this. So it's just kind of my own responses to what I understand of ICH practices. So there are those associated with common landscape features, like Clutie Wells or rowan trees, and kind of the approach to them. Those associated with one specific location, so for example, the Heart of Midlothian in Edinburgh Old Town on the Royal Mile, and the spitting on that. And again, for a lot of these practices, the origins aren't necessarily important. You know, it's that they're practiced today by a community of people is what makes them important. The events, for example, New Year's dips, egg rolling and Easter, first footing, the Mela, and Hopchinare Festival, which is like the Halloween festival. Loco-specific events, so these link to particular towns, such as the Buryman of South Queensferry, which is obviously a very kind of visually specific one as well. ICH linked to crafts and crafting, so traditional Ganzi making and patterns, walking songs, dry stone diking approaches. Again, all of these tend to be very regional, so you can kind of really see the potential of working with particular communities. And I'm sure most communities that you work with will have one that they're very proud of or they're aware of. And a lot of these things involve production of something and kind of getting people together to create something, which is really a great healing practice in its own right. This is associated with food, so salt and sauce in Edinburgh, that being a thing you get in the chip shop, things like this. Regional fry-ups, stuff that the different breads that are used in different areas, really interesting. There's a brilliant book by Kieran Carson, the poet, about the Irish poet, about traditional fry-ups in different parts of Ireland and how that's connected to traditional music in different parts of Ireland. It's just brilliant. And again, that brings us to the next one, music as ICH, so trad music, folk music, sayings, things like this. It's not just rural, so industrial songs, strike songs, things like this. And of course, minority language use. So you can kind of see, again, I'm sure every communities that's represented in the chat today will have a really interesting, or several probably, example of ICH that they can use. And just quickly, I mean, we very deliberately talk about ICH in Scotland rather than Scottish ICH because we recognise that wherever there's a community who comes together still to practice something that is brilliant, lively, wonderful ICH in Scotland. It doesn't have to be, ancient and sort of used by the tourist board or very famous. It can be used by sort of migrant groups arriving in Scotland or different types of groups like this, and can be quite unofficial as well. So I've included these two photographs, neither of which are very good because I took them recently on my phone, so they're not great, but they're two wonderful examples of ICH that took place near my flat in Leith Links. And in both examples, I didn't know that it was on at all. It was just walking through on the weekend, walking through the park and seeing this wonderful examples of ICH. So we have on the left the Edinburgh Mela, which was a brilliant kind of range of ICH practices, from music, this parade, wonderful food, and on the right is a Ghanaian event that was happening in Leith Links. And I've just called it event because it was so unexpected. I actually didn't manage to find out what it was representing, but it was brilliant because you can see this person who's dressed and has this face paint, and they were kind of running into the crowd to get people to dance, and there's brilliant music and singing, and there was lots of people cooking, like barbecuing food all the way around and stuff. And it was great because the people that I had spoken to had said that people were coming down from Aberdeen, from Inverness, from Glasgow. I think a few people, I spoke to one person at the Mela who had come up from Manchester. And you can sense the relief on people coming together from really far away to this one place to kind of celebrate cultural traditions with people, and probably not having been able to for the past few years because of the pandemic. So there was a real sense of relief of doing this and of doing it kind of in this big parkland. And I just thought that was so interesting and a really positive way of showing how people from a really spread out places can come together to partake in these living traditions, which seemed really positive. I'm just going to talk really quickly about the possibilities of addressing quite challenging histories that museums and community groups have, but I don't think this link works. So what I'm going to do is, as I'm just sharing my screen, I'll just come back here and make sure that, that I've got sound. Okay, hopefully you can see that. I'm just going to play a little bit of a video from a presentation that National Museums Northern Ireland gave us a few years ago about their Collecting the Troubles and Beyond project and gallery. And again, it was a really good, I'm always really impressed by how they can respond to just really challenging recent and in many ways continual kind of histories and presence. And I think that was a really important part of this project. And the idea of non-neutrality from museums and saying, well, inevitably with displaying some of this material, you know, that it is really challenging, but people are saying that they have a real response to reflect several communities at once, actually, which is a challenge, but is important for museums and creative responses to try and do when addressing problematic history. So I'll just play a minute of this.
And that sort of escalation of tension. So as I mentioned, it's really important that we represented multiple perspectives, and you know, the traumatic events of the years after 1968 touched almost everyone who lived here and many others from further afield. And inevitably that interpretation of those events is going to be contested in terms of significance, meaning and responsibility, because while we have a shared past, we don't have a shared memory on this. So I mentioned that we had open calls for people to come forward with material, and we were offered a really wide range of material in response to that. And that was across the province, it was across all different backgrounds. It was ex-combatants, it was ex-service, it was people that had been affected, victims and survivors, like a woman who had worked as a nurse during the Troubles, people that had just lived through that period, full range. And you can see here some examples of the fur coat on the bottom left was worn by Judith Jennings when she was attacked at Burntullet. The picture of the child in the top right is Patrick Rooney, who was the first child to be killed in the Troubles, and his brother came forward with testimony. So right across the board, and you can see some examples. There's the LGBT history that I mentioned as well, and even just scrapbooks that people kept, and ongoing inquiry.
So I'll stop that video there, and hopefully you can continue to see the presentation. I was really struck by this phrase, while we have a shared past, we do not have a shared memory. And I think that's true regardless of the histories that we're aiming to memorialise. That's true. You know, so I think that's just something really interesting to bear in mind in projects like this. And all of these videos are available on our website, so I can share a link to that afterwards as well, because there should be some interesting things to respond to there as well. Yeah, and I just wanted to end with some idea of kind of different ways personally that I'm interested in kind of the act of memorialisation and putting things down. So I run a poetry and pints night as well, which is quite an interesting night that I really enjoy, and it's based in Leith, and it's very community focused, and there's a strong I'm really keen to get a developmental role. So we have featured poets who get slightly longer to present and to read their poetry, and I'm aiming to try and be able to produce pamphlets, limited run pamphlets for each featured poet each month or so, and these are just some of the posters that I've put up for these. But I suppose I was interested in bringing this up for this talk because I've talked a lot about museums and galleries and a lot about physical material culture museum collections, but I don't think that is necessarily needed at all in terms of to tell these stories and to get the same kind of responses. So I often think that you know, an image, a poetic image, when formalized in a poem on paper, maybe has the same kind of impact or the same bit of space is taken up as a museum object might be in an exhibition, in terms of illustrating a point or sometimes contrasting a point. But it's all about trying to encourage meaning and to kind of share meaning in different ways. And I just think that's a really interesting potential as well. Yeah, I think that's what I was going to say there. And that ends my presentation really. It's interesting because I'm just sitting here in the MGS office on Castle Street, and I don't know if you can hear it, but in the background, I think the cannon have started for the Queen. She'll be going up the Royal Mile just now, and I don't know. It seems like an interesting thing to consider in the context of memorialisation as well. But if maybe you can hear that in the background, but don't be alarmed if you can. That's what it is. But that's me really. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Very much, Jacob. Incredible. I mean, I'm sure anyone's just listened to that. I've been able to make so many links to the Remembering Together project. I have made such a list of things that really resonated with me. So I'm just going to point a few out. I loved what you said about we can have a shared past, but we can't have a shared memory. I never thought of it like that before. I just absolutely love that. It's really great to get insights more on intangible culture and heritage. That really resonates with me as someone who speaks Cymraeg, Welsh. There's only 800,000 Welsh speakers in the UK, you know, so we definitely rely on our oral traditions, you know, our knowledge from our ancestors to be able to, our crafts, so many different practices within that language that we rely on the survival of that language. So when I think of Welsh speakers, I often think of Gaelic speakers as well, you know, being up in Scotland and stuff. And I'm sure there's lots of other people here who will be working with communities that don't have English as their first language. And so how can we tap into their traditions and their histories in order for us to be, you know, be able to share different viewpoints and different needs within a community project? I think that's really fascinating. I love the idea of museums as physical spaces. Of course, I know that. I've been to many museums in my lifetime, and I know communities use them, but I hadn't thought of them as actual community spaces myself. And I think what I loved about that point, Jacob, was you talking about using them as healing spaces, because this entire project is about healing. It's about, you know, working with members of the community who have been most impacted by COVID, but also remembering those lives have been lost. So there's a huge amount of healing to be done there. And by doing the memorialisation, hopefully we can capture and support people in that process. And of course, support the people who are involved with it in terms of project partners and artists as well. I remember when we had our briefing session before we did the talk today, there's one thing that really resonated with me when you explained to me that sometimes stories within museums don't get told because those objects don't exist to tell them. And I think that's what I love about this presentation today. It gave me insights into other ways of doing that, you know, and I loved all the different community examples that I used. And the map you showed at the beginning, a few people commented on that in the chat box, and they're asking if you can share the presentation, if they can have a copy afterwards, because I would myself love to have another look at that map and really see the differences, you know, around Scotland and stuff. They're just some reflections, but were there any reflections for you putting the presentation together? Because I'm aware when people work in their jobs, you're just getting on with it. But sometimes you don't have that time and the space to reflect on it yourself. And did that happen to you?
Yeah, to an extent, I think. Yeah, thanks. I mean, what you said there about what we talked about, which was that stories sometimes are not told because there's not the objects. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and it's something that I really want museums to focus on quite widely. And I suppose for me, kind of considering this question, it kind of brought it all home to me, the fact that from my point of view, the areas of my work can feel quite separate, but they're not at all. So I was speaking about intangible cultural heritage there, and then I was speaking you know, about museums more generally, but it's also connected actually. And I think that was really clear to me that museums don't necessarily need to actively collect objects in an area in order to tell those stories. You know, actually what they can do is go to the communities that they're part of and see what stories people want to be told, you know, and tell them in whatever ways they can. So whether it's through actively collecting and building a collection of physical objects, or whether it's you know, getting people in to respond to their existing collections in a creative way and kind of ask them to tell a certain story, or if it's just to say run an event, a creative event, and kind of get people together for a particular reason. I suppose it made me realise that, yeah, museums are so much more than a place to walk in, read some panels, and then leave. That, you know, the act of bringing people together is a massively important role for museums. So yeah, that sort of became quite clear for me, and the interconnectedness of all of this, yeah, felt clear.
Yeah, absolutely, and more important now than ever, like I say, with
Yeah.
all the social issues that are happening, but in particular with the COVID. So it's great that you've been able to reflect on what museums have had to do currently in order to respond to that. And that's it. I'm just going to end before I open it up to the audience, to the people here. But I really liked when you talked about how museums are a great resource for tapping into, and how people can use it as a creative response. Now, in my other role, I work part-time for Craft Scotland, and I'm very passionate about working with craft makers in order for us to run residencies. But I'm always looking for partners where we can drop makers into resources and heritage sites and museums and stuff in order for them to gain access to resources they didn't even know that existed. You know, and I think that's why it's so important to advocate and talk about the kind of work you do, because there might be a resource, a collection, or a project that's happened out there that could be perfect for a maker or an artist to tap into, but they didn't know that it happened. So I'm always interested in knowing what goes on out there in order for us to be able to do something with it, and to be able to not only just do a creative response to something as a creative practitioner, but also to, like I say, how can we link communities into them and what comes out of it. But yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we go to questions?
Don't think so. Just, yeah, look forward if there are any questions, try and answer them as fully as possible. So
yeah, we've got something from Kirsten here in the chat. Thank you, Jacob. That was such a brilliant insight. We'll definitely be looking more into some of those examples shared. I absolutely feel the same. I think that you've just left me lots of things I just want to go and research now, for sure. Has anyone got a question for Jacob? Feel free to put in the chat, or you can just appear on the screen. I know there's quite a lot of information to take in there. Is there anything in particular? No, not at the moment. I'll just have a look at what else I made notes of.
I was going to say as well,
yeah.
just saying, like, about yeah, looking into more examples. I mean, we spoke a bit about potentially sharing links and stuff, and we can share up with everything that I've really spoken about. So there's an ICH in Scotland website which is dedicated wiki really for trying to take note of the different intangible cultural heritage practices across Scotland, and we're really at the moment trying to get more examples onto that website. So I'll share a link to that, and if anybody can have a look through the website and see what's there, and if you think, okay, like, yeah, there's an intangible cultural heritage practice from my community or the community that I work with that's not on here, definitely you can send me an email and we'll get that uploaded, because it'd be really good to get more examples on. So I think that could be interesting.
That's great. Thanks, Jacob. Got a question in for you from Christina. What does memorialisation mean to you as a museum development manager?
It's a very good question. Yeah. Well, I think it's important. Let me just think about this answer. I suppose museum development manager, my role, it can be quite. I'm not here to tell museums what to do in terms of memorialisation, for example. So museum development manager, I mean, that really is a title referring, I suppose, to the role of helping museums to continually develop and to kind of remain quite healthy organisations, and and remain true to kind of their purpose within their communities. So I suppose for me, a really important part of that is, I think museums, within my role, I would want museums to play a really active role within their own communities, which is a plural. There'll be many communities that museums work with, rather than one. But I think it's important when there's been community loss or big kind of events within the communities that museums represent. It is important for a museum to engage with this in some way. I'm really interested in I suppose memorialisation as not necessarily like a physical memorial, in some ways. So I think we saw in the ICH definition that heritage isn't just built heritage. It's not just it's not necessarily ancient or stately homes over this, castles, things like that. Heritage can be anything. It can be a living act. It can be coming together. It can be music, things like this. And I think the same is very much true with memorialisation. So people remember things very differently and respond to things very differently. But if they can be in some way encouraged to come together and look at both very, very ancient history, but also present and recent history in this way, I think that in itself is an interesting act of memorialisation. It doesn't need to necessarily be a physical thing. It can just be the act of coming together and talking, or coming together and creating something, or just having your voice heard in some way, heard by others who maybe went through a similar thing. So that's a very rambling answer to say, I suppose it means lots of different things to me within my role.
That's great, thanks, Jacob. Apologies from Christina. That was a tricky question, but thank you for your response.
It's a very interesting question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's very broad, isn't it? And like you say, people are connected to projects and places for many different reasons, but often people's reasons for working somewhere is much in line with their own values in their personal lives as well. And we're all drawn to things for many more reasons than just there to do a job, right?
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's it. There's like, it feels like there's a strong element of participation, in any way that people can get involved in some way in an act of memorialisation, whether that's just voicing their own story to people who are listening, or if it's creating something for that, or feeling heard in some way. That is just a really important part of this, and I suppose it's all just about people being involved in some way, and again, I think that's really interesting as well, that the idea that museums are changing. We no longer think of one central authoritative figure making all decisions, deciding what language is used, what stories are told, what is remembered and what is not. If we can have active participation and lots of different voices, that is what's going to be really important in terms of memorializing with museums, I think.
Absolutely, and just to reflect on that, Emma message to say feeling heard is really fundamental.
Yeah,
absolutely, and that's fundamental to this project. And that's one challenge it'll be for all of us, is how do we make sure that everyone's voice is being heard and given equal voice there as well. Yes, and Emma says being acknowledged. I think that's true to the healing process as well, isn't it? And Emma says a place to go, absolutely, which can be challenging if it is not a physical memorial. So maybe it's the memory through the conversations you had. Maybe it was a cup of tea in a cafe and we talked about it, and that becomes the place you go for comfort.
Yeah, it's interesting because I suppose if we think about the world the World War memorials as physical places that like museum, most of us have them in our towns and villages, you know. And it's the act of coming together to lay a wreath or whatever that makes these places still matter, I suppose, in many ways. You know, that's how people remember what they represent, is by coming together at them and recognizing that, maybe taking a moment, discussing that. And I think that's so important, that, you know, that's what keeps meaning in these places, is people keep coming to them, or keep understanding what they are, and keep talking about them, you know. So they're a physical place, but the reason they're still a place of memorialisation is because people are responding to them in some way. And I think that seems to me quite key.
Absolutely. I can see some more people putting some questions in the chat box there. We'll just take another 2 minutes for questions, and then I'd love to ask you all to just put some reflections in the chat box. What resonated the most with you today, perhaps with Jacob? Maybe what questions is it leaving you with? Where you're going to go with your research or your practice next? Or any other reflection you've got on today's session. We'd love to know that. So we've just got about another 7 minutes or so before we finish. So we've got Kevin Harrison, who works for ArtLink Central. He's just posting in something here. It's interesting to think about I can't even say the word sometimes. Memorialisation. I can't even say it today. Sorry. Memorialisation. No, it's not coming. You know what I'm trying to say here, as being an ongoing and long-term activity, creating new cultural events and traditions that stand the test of time. And we've got Emma. Is there something around the ongoing nature of memorialisation? Did it that time. So as a live and evolving thing.
Yeah, interesting. Definitely. I mean, that when talking about intangible cultural heritage, which, you know, which isn't necessarily a memorial thing, but the key thing for intangible cultural heritage to still be important to those communities is that it's living and that it still means something. So I think, yeah, there can often be an idea that heritage or events have happened and that's it, you know, that's it, they stay like that. But actually, meaning and understandings of history needs to change over time in order for it to keep mattering in many ways. And I think that's really the same thing with the act of remembering, memorialisation. Yeah, that it needs to evolve alongside the values of the people who are doing the memorialisation, you know, and that to me feels like a key parallel with living heritage and living culture in that way, which is exactly what that is, I think. Yeah, if there's some way of allowing stuff to evolve and change with the people that are doing it, I think that is really positive, and allowing it, and, you know, yeah, letting it, and perhaps potentially encouraging this, because understandings of what has happened changes over time, I suppose, and that's what keeps things mattering in many ways, you know.
Absolutely.